You ready? Oh. Is the flag in the shot? Is the flag in the shot? Is that okay? Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am very pleased to welcome you to the fifth of the Committee on the Present Danger China's threat briefings, as we are now calling them. I'm particularly pleased to have with us via live streaming and the miracle of videotape many others who couldn't be with us today, but I'm extremely pleased that we have so many members of the committee and others who are with us to talk about the 30th anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre, and for that matter, what preceded it and what has come after it, including most especially what has emerged in recent years as the present danger from China. My name is Frank Gaffney. I'm the president of the Center for Security, the executive chairman of the Center for Security Policy, the president of Save the Persecuted Christians, and in my capacity today as sort of the master of ceremonies, vice chairman of the Committee on the Present Danger China. Others of you who have heard this before, I would ask you just bear with me, but just a very quick introduction of the concept of the Committee on the Present Danger. This was an organization that came together in several different incarnations over the past 50 years or so. We're very pleased to have with us Chet Nagel, who was at a time the executive director of one of the earlier incarnations. The most signally consequential of them, I believe, was the one that formed up in the 1970s that helped one of its members, a gentleman by the name of Ronald Reagan, conceive of and begin to articulate and then to begin to execute a strategy for defeating that era's most dangerous totalitarian communist regime, which sought the destruction of this country, namely the Soviet Union. We find ourselves today facing what is, I would argue, an even more grave existential threat to freedom, our own and that of others around the world, in the form of the Chinese Communist Party and the country that it has been misruling for decades now. We're going to talk about that danger from a number of vantage points. We're very pleased to have men who actually were in Tiananmen Square at the time of the events that we're commemorating this week. The 30th anniversary literally fell somewhere between today and tomorrow. It will be marked by our friends at the Victim of Communism Memorial tomorrow. We're noting its anniversary today. And in the course of the program, I think we'll get a lot of very important insights into how this threat has emerged, what we have ourselves done to intensify it, and what we must do to contend with it in the future. To kick us off, I'm very pleased to introduce the chairman of the Committee on the Present Danger China, Brian Kennedy. He formerly was the president of the Claremont Institute and today is the founder and president of American Strategy Group, a man with a great understanding of the sweep of history and the challenges that freedom has faced through many of those years. And I'm very proud to call him, as well as our leader, a dear friend, Brian Kennedy.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you for all you do here in Washington to make Americans safe and to understand their freedom. And thank you, everyone, for joining us here today. This Tuesday, as Frank said, marks the 30th anniversary of Tiananmen Square, where the People's Liberation Army killed thousands of students who were protesting how the Chinese Communist Party was running the country. That it was a human rights atrocity is obvious. It was one more deadly incarnation of Mao Zedong's belief that political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. As atrocities go, however, it paled in comparison to the mass murder committed by the Chinese Communist Party and their Red Guards during the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, where it is believed that 40 to 70 million people died to remake China into the country we see today. Given that this was carried out by Chairman Mao, the ideological inspiration for President Xi, examination of these events are surprisingly hard to come by. They shouldn't be. The difference, of course, was that Tiananmen was in 1989, and America had embraced the People's Republic and had fully endowed this new relationship with the belief that economic liberalization would lead to political liberalization and democracy was soon to follow, an arrogance that we seem not yet to have overcome. However hopeful observers may have been, the events in Tiananmen Square demonstrated that the viciousness of the Chinese Communist Party was not about to subside. Talk of democracy and reform was not going to be tolerated, including from university students who included, it should be noted, the children of China's ruling elite. No one would be above the party, including those privileged families who would make up China's future. It was a lesson meant to be learned by both the ruling elite and the common people. The Chinese Communist Party was to be put before anything else. What should be addressed this June 4th is not so much the lives that were lost that day. The memory of their sacrifice lives on among freedom-loving people everywhere, but rather the collective naivete of America and the West, who believed that Tiananmen was an unfortunate detour in what was surely to be the road to political and economic modernization. Although American leaders would voice symbolic protestations at the time, their understanding of the nature of the Chinese Communist Party was almost non-existent. Not merely would the United States look the other way during China's ongoing trampling of human rights, but would transfer to them during the Clinton administration our most advanced nuclear missile technology, grant them most favored nation status, and share with them technological advances that would propel China into the 21st century as a superpower competitor to the United States. It was during this period that we have witnessed the perfection of Chinese communist system into the most sophisticated political organization the world has ever seen. They can control 1.4 billion people through state control of the media and the internet, engage in commerce throughout Asia, North and South America, Europe, and Africa, and develop intricate political and business relationships wherever necessary among those individual nations' ruling elites. The PRC easily blends what appears externally like a free market system with ruthless mercantilism. They deploy their state intelligence services as an arm of the nation's state-owned enterprises and engage in the theft of hundreds of billions of dollars in intellectual property and forced technology transfers from America and Western companies. One cannot be surprised that this is how the Chinese Communist Party behaves. After all, it is their purpose, in their mind, to destroy Western capitalism. What is disturbing is the corruption of American business and political elites who continue to defend the PRC, in reality the Chinese Communist Party, and serve as a powerful lobby against President Trump's common sense defense of American interests. If there's a way to honor those who died in Tiananmen Square and those people in China who today yearn for freedom, it is the vigilance of President Trump in helping this committee educate 300 million Americans about the true state of affairs in China. Our dedication to the rule of law, constitutional government, and the principles of human freedom remain the last best hope of Earth. It is the purpose of this committee to do our part to help them any way we can. We have a great lineup of speakers with us here today, and I thank you very much for being part of what we do, and I thank Frank Gaffney again for his leadership of this committee.
Brian, thank you very much. We're going to kick things off in terms of our tribute to those who lost their lives in Tiananmen Square, as well as those who have suffered horrifically at the hands of the Chinese Communist Party before and since, with one of the men who has had the extraordinary courage to stand against them inside China for quite some time. He's been described as a self-taught lawyer, a barefoot lawyer at that, working for the people of China in rural communities, advocating on behalf of their human rights, their rights particularly as women, and to the land, and in so many other ways, acting afoul of the government of China, which arrested him, incarcerating him as a political prisoner, from which he managed, in one of the great feats of all time, to escape, overcoming the handicap that is obvious and making his way to the American embassy, from which he was ultimately allowed to leave and come to this country, where he now leads, I think, both by example and through his writings and his speeches, the cause of freedom for the people of China from outside, and we are profoundly grateful to him for being with us. He is, of course, Chen Guangcheng, and I understand he will be accompanied by a translator who will help him share with us some of his insights into what has been the fate of China as a result of Tiananmen's lingering toll. Will you all come on up here to the microphone? Is that possible? Welcome.
OK， 好，各位女士、各位先生，大家好，非常高兴呢，今天下午能在这儿跟大家交流，也非常谢谢这个 Frank 先生的热情介绍。
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very happy to be here this afternoon with all of you, and I would like to thank Frank for his kind introduction.
那么今天呢，站在这里，说实话，心情有点沉重。30年了，1989年中国那场发自于北京、扩大到全国的民主运动，并没有像东欧的其他国家一样解除共产专制的魔咒，让中国实现民主、宪政、法治、自由，而是在6月3号晚上、4号的凌晨，遭到中共用机枪、坦克、装甲车等直接的血腥镇压。
Today, standing here, I have a very heavy heart. It's been 30 years. In 1989, what happened in Beijing and swept to the rest of China, the whole China, didn't come to what happened to Eastern Europe later. It didn't allow China to embark on the road of freedom and democracy.
那么实际上， 在那次屠杀当中，根据美国相关解密信息，至少有10454人在北京被中共屠杀，28796人伤残。那么当然这个数字不是一个确切的数字，很多人可能远远的都没有被统计进去。至少呢，这个说明中共一直宣称的天安门广场没有死人，纯粹是一种谎言。
OK， 第一个数字是多少？1万多。
10454。
According to the newly released information from the United States, that massacre actually led to the deaths of 10,454 people. And also it caused 28,796 injuries. So that lay bare the very lie of the CCP that nobody died on the Tiananmen Square.
我想，我们也从其他国家的，比如说英国这个档案馆解密的信息，还有像加拿大其他国家的解密的信息来看，这个数字都是非常接近的。当然，这是一个不完全的统计啊，实际的数字可能要远远大于这些。
And we have other sources of information, such as those from the British archives and from Canada, that these are inaccurate or incomplete statistics. More people have died or injured during the massacre.
那么，在大家把注意力都集中在北京的天安门大屠杀，或者说是北京的这个屠杀的这个事情上，我觉得实际上当时中共所想要面对的，绝不仅仅是北京。我在监狱的时候听到一个青岛的学生领袖亲口告诉我，中共在89屠杀之前，在全国各第2线、第3线城市都做了荷枪实弹的这个军队的准备。青岛的军队是从新疆紧急空运过去的。
Actually, the Chinese Communist regime wasn't just paying attention to what was happening in Beijing. They were prepared to deal with the rest of the country, the second tier and even third tier cities in China. While I was in prison, I heard a student leader from Qingdao who told me that all the cities, all the secondary and third kind of third-tier cities in China were prepared with army soldiers who have real bullets. And those soldiers in Qingdao were dispatched from Xinjiang.
所以我们说，中共当时要在中国进行的这场屠杀，是中国共产党向全中国人民这个来自俄罗斯的邪恶政权，向全国人民的一个宣战，毫不为过。
It is no exaggeration to say that the massacre carried out by the CCP was targeted at the whole Chinese nation.
所以从那以后，尽管中共嘴上说的很好听，实际上中共是把中国人民当成战俘来对待，是用比军费还高的维稳经费来把中国人民当成头号敌人来加以防范的。
Ever since then, the CCP regime has treated the whole Chinese people as prisoners of war. That's why they're spending more money on maintaining what they call social stability than their military expenditure.
所以89民运之后特别是在6次屠杀以后，中共在中国大力的建立和扩大了像武警系统、像国保系统来对人民进行控制。
That's why, after the democracy movement, the Chinese Communist Party has established and expanded their armed police system and their national security system.
那么89之后20年里，共产党不断的在全国进行这种各种形式的，像黑头套、黑帮绑架、黑监狱、解放、非法拘禁、非法关押等等这一系列的对中国人民的任何一种争取权利的打压。
你先说20年。
对，先说后不是20年，后边10年有点变化，我要
OK. In the 20 years after the 1989 massacre, the Chinese Communist regime has been carrying out all sorts of black practices, including gangsters, black prison, and other forms to suppress the Chinese people.
那么随着中共的打压，那中国人民的觉醒也越来越强，那么这种反抗也就越来越多。那么中共已经没有办法靠原来的形式继续这样进行下去。那么最近10年，中共干脆就撕掉法律的遮羞布，直接把法律修改，为了他抢夺民财的方便，为了他维护专权的方便，为了他打击中国人民的方便，那就把以前原来的很多这种像绑架、失踪合法化，写进法律第73条。
As the Chinese people awakened, the communist regime intensified its suppression. That includes not only illegal kidnapping, disappearance, and including revision of their relative laws.
所以我们看到呢，中共在这个法律当中就说，如果共产党认为有必要，他就可以把这些人抓走，关到黑监狱里，美其名曰指定监视居住，半年之内可以不通知律师和家属，而且根据共产党自己的需要，他可以无限期的半年的去延长。那这段时间恰恰就是他们对这些人实施残酷酷刑迫害的一段时间。
That's why they say in their law that if deemed necessary, you can be thrown into prison anytime and can be held there for up to 6 months. And all sorts of things, bad things, could happen to you during those 6 months.
就在这个时候，他们就不通知律师和家属。
And they even do not notify your lawyers and your family members.
而且还可以半年的不断延长。
And they can extend it 6 months after 6 months.
所以中共在这个时候已经彻底的撕下了法律的外衣。
That's how the Chinese Communist Party has totally stripped of themselves the so-called legal protection, their clothes of law.
所以中国人民说，一声枪响，由偷变抢。那89年的枪声一响以后，共产党原来从贪污变成了直接的抢劫，所以这30年来，中共对于中国人民进行强拆，对于中国农民的耕地进行强占，对于敢于上访的人直接进行殴打，甚至直接被打死，在发生在中国直接被中共残害的人数，我们现在完全没有办法统计。
That's why the Chinese people say, one crack of the gunshot, the officials have transformed themselves from stealers to robbers. What they do is no less than highway robbery. They demolish people's houses by force, and they occupy farmlands by force, and they even just beat up people as they wish.
像山东的李书莲，就是因为去上访而被共产党派的这特务直接打死，还有这个像青岛的这个农民，为了看着自己的土地不被中共抢走，那么中共晚上竟然派人这个到他这个土地里的房屋上给他浇上油，点火把他活活烧死，这就是中共干的邪恶。
Let me give you two examples. One is Mr. Li Shulian from Shandong. The other one is a farmer from Qingdao. What the Chinese Communist Party did to him was to pour oil on his house, in his farmland, and just burn it down.
对，然后他的女儿李淑莲的女儿为母亲申冤10年，到现在没有一个结果。
And the daughter of Mr. Li Shulian has been appealing for 10 years without any result.
所以，像6·4这样的事情，虽然没有大规模的在中国再次发生，但是以另一种别样的形式，在全国此起彼伏的不断存在。中共对中国人民的屠杀一天也没有停下来，只是零星的发生，不被全世界注意。中国人民争取权利的反抗也从来没有停下来。
Although the June 4th massacre did not happen again, an event of such large scale didn't happen again, other forms of suppression has been happening one after another throughout China, and it did not cause enough attention from the international community.
所以最后我想说，我们对于6·4，我们不要什么中共平反，我们需要反思，用什么样的方法让中共为他当年的屠杀承担责任，如何去追究中共这个邪恶刽子手政权的责任，让全世界站在中国人民一边，去推动中国人民反抗中共暴政，让中国早日实现民主，把中共送入历史，这是我们应该考虑的。
So right now what I'm calling for is not a vindication from the Chinese Communist Party, but we would rather make the Chinese Communist Party to shoulder the responsibilities for that massacre, and I call on the world to support the Chinese people in their fight for freedom and democracy.
好的，谢谢大家。
Thank you all.
Thank you. 谢谢。咱们还有回答问题。OK.
Thank you so much.
OK.
Thank you.
No problem. Thank you. Don't worry. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chen Guangcheng. It's heartbreaking to have to goad him off the stage, I have to tell you. We've just got so much that I promised to accomplish today that we're going to have to move forward. So thank you again for your leadership and courage. I think a perfect complement to what we've just heard is a man who will reflect as well as exemplify those who are fighting against communism worldwide. His name is Marion Smith. These days he is the executive director of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, an extraordinarily important organization which will be holding a vigil on the Capitol grounds tomorrow. And I commend to you that program as well. I couldn't be more pleased that he's been able to be with us, having just blown in from Budapest, I think, over the weekend, where he was commemorating the experiences of people there under Soviet communism. I did just want to say, as I introduce him, not only how much I appreciate the work he's doing, but also the leadership of the chairman of the foundation, Lee Edwards. Dr. Lee Edwards is a man who has done incalculably important work over many decades to try to make sure that no one forgets. Indeed, that everyone understands both the past as well as the abiding danger posed to us by the totalitarian ideology of communism under whatever brand it operates. And to speak about that as it relates specifically to the Chinese experience, past, present, and future, I'm very pleased to welcome Marion Smith.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's good to be with you. I see a lot of friends and freedom fighters in this room, and I admire your work. And I know that many of you have been doing your work long before China was named a top threat, top competitor, and revisionist power in the national security strategy. So your work takes on an important new dimension now. I want to thank you, Brian Kennedy and Frank Gaffney, for your leadership of the Committee on the Present Danger. Thank you, Chen Guangchen, for your reflections and your tireless work on behalf of the Chinese people. I'm proud to note that Chen is one of our Truman Reagan Medal of Freedom laureates, and so is most recently Cardinal Zen, Joseph Zen, former Bishop of Hong Kong. And these two individuals will be joined tomorrow by a Chinese memory organization that I'll tell you more about in a few minutes. In China today, the truth is illegal. Chinese citizens are not permitted to talk about what happened in and around Tiananmen Square 30 years ago, when the Chinese Communist Party deployed the People's Liberation Army against the Chinese unarmed protesters, many of them students. Out of that drama, we get the image of Tank Man, with which I'm sure you're all familiar. And while it is an iconic image portraying the events of June 4th in a certain sense, it is also perhaps a useful image for the Communist Party's own narrative. The reason I say that is, in that image, the street is tidy. The tanks will inevitably overcome Tank Man. His resistance is seemingly futile. And most importantly, it distracts from the blood, the shock, the chaos, the heart-wrenching turn of events that doomed the people of China to tyranny for 30 more years and counting. We don't know the exact death toll, but as Chen was talking about, we do know from a few diplomatic cables and other information that came out at the time, one in particular by the British ambassador in Beijing, that the toll was a minimum of 10,000. It is scandalous today that most Chinese do not know the full story of the massacre and are not allowed to talk about it. Mention of these events are absent from Chinese textbooks. State-controlled media are silent. Awkward telecasts every June 4th read the day's headlines without a mention of the anniversary. On the mainland, you don't speak about what happened in 1989, and online the topic is censored. Those who raise the specter of Tiananmen are harassed and jailed. Here in America, dozens of universities are complicit in this erasure of history because they work with so-called Confucius institutes to maintain propaganda, ministry-approved study of China. And just in the last few days, Twitter, of their own volition, apparently, suspended the accounts of Chinese dissidents critical of the Chinese Communist Party and vocal about the anniversary of Tiananmen Square massacre. As a result of Communist Party censorship and Western collusion, many Chinese remain in the dark about why it happened, who was killed, and what happened to their families. We have done too little to fill in the blanks. Beijing's crackdown is rarely discussed within diplomatic and business circles, lest it rankle Sino-U.S. relations or disrupt Wall Street. For years, in fact, the West has overlooked or sidestepped China's capacity for violent repression in favor of dovish overtures. Such a strategy has proven dangerously naive against the Chinese Communist Party. Those of us in the West who benefit from freedom of speech have a responsibility to defend truthful memory against those who would make us forget. Revealing the truth means coming to terms with how millions of Chinese citizens felt about their government. In addition to Beijing's murderous response carried out on the orders of Deng Xiaoping, the communist leader known in the West for his liberalization of the Chinese economy. What happened in the spring of 1989 was far bloodier than any image or news report seen by us in the West. The Communist Party viewed the Tiananmen protests, one of many across the country in the spring of '89, as an existential threat. Party hardliners feared a potential government coup, and as a result, they won the debate in the intra-party discussion about what to do. From that moment began a reign of oppression and manipulation of the Chinese people through ultra-nationalism and propaganda, a reign that has not ended. Those party hardliners feared the unarmed student protesters. They feared a modest statue that they erected in Tiananmen Square. The student protesters called it the goddess of democracy, and it was patterned after our own Statue of Liberty. And here, please allow me to take a few words in tribute to the great man that Frank spoke about, Lee Edwards. He's chairman of our foundation, and it took over a decade of work by Lee and many others, but in 2007, President George W. Bush dedicated the first memorial in the world in honor of every single victim of communism since 1917. If you haven't seen it, the Victims of Communism Memorial is at the corner of New Jersey and Massachusetts Avenues, a few blocks away. And by selecting the Sino-specific symbol for the memorial, which is a bronze replica of the Goddess of Democracy statue, that decision was controversial at the time, but Lee understood something important. The Berlin Wall had fallen, but communism hadn't, and the most powerful remaining communist dictatorship was, of course, the People's Republic of China. The choice of that symbol has proven prescient now that Americans are wising up to the fact that the greatest threat to freedom and peace in the world today is the Chinese Communist Party. One of the principal ways in which unjust regimes govern without the consent of their people is by distorting history and hiding truth. To be sure, the China of today is not Mao's China. The Communist Party since the 1990s has incorporated limited market-based reforms, but China remains a single-party communist dictatorship that stifles free speech and dissent, and under Xi Jinping remains officially committed to socialism with Chinese characteristics. China's government stubbornly refuses to come to terms with the victims it has unjustly imprisoned, sent to labor camps, and killed, a number in the tens of millions, far eclipsing the murderous Nazi and Soviet regimes. Human rights activists and dissidents like Chen Guangchen are harassed, persecuted, and forced to flee the country. As Czech novelist Milan Kundera has noted, the struggle of man against power is the struggle of memory against forgetting. That struggle requires that we tell the truth and advocate for human rights, even when inconvenient. Ultimately, however, I believe this is the most strategically sound path. Soviet dissident Natan Sharansky has called human rights a, quote, powerful non-conventional weapon against which the other side has no defense. Even though the CCP is successfully revising history for a generation of young Chinese, China's government is failing in its efforts to erase the past because, in the words of Hannah Arendt, the holes of oblivion do not exist. Nothing human is that perfect, and there are simply too many people in the world to make oblivion possible. Indeed, courageous men and women still speak out, including those whose loved ones were killed in the massacre 30 years ago. The memory organization comprised of Chinese individuals I mentioned earlier are the Tiananmen Mothers. The Tiananmen Mothers deserve our attention and our support. The boys and girls killed in the early morning hours of June 4th, 30 years ago, were their sons and daughters. And they, more than anyone else, refused to let the world forget what happened. China's rulers have tried to muzzle the Tiananmen Mothers in every way. Although they are elderly, authorities routinely throw them into prison, place them under house arrest, monitor their every movement, block their communication, and disrupt their daily lives. And yet, still the mothers refuse to back down. As a group, these mothers wrote in a letter earlier this year that the indomitable courage of their children, the ones they lost, has always been with them, and this is why the Tiananmen Mothers will never be silent. The Tiananmen Mothers continue the fight for freedom that their sons and daughters started. They have inspired a new generation of leaders and freedom fighters in China and across the world to renew the struggle against the tyranny of the Chinese Communist Party. They remind us that 30 years ago, the will of the Chinese people was thwarted by the will of the Communist Party, the guilty party, the party that still governs. For their courage and perseverance, the Tiananmen Mothers have our recognition and our solidarity. And tomorrow at 1:30, we'll be co-hosting a major rally with more than 20 other organizations on the Capitol grounds, and we'll be bestowing our Truman Reagan Medal of Freedom on the Tiananmen Mothers, and I hope all of you will join us. We'll also be opening an exhibit photograph exhibit about their sons and daughters, also on the Capitol grounds. And this evening, as Frank mentioned, at 8 o'clock, we're hosting a candlelight vigil at the Victims of Communism Memorial, and you all are also invited to join us there. Thank you for your attention, for the invitation. Thank you for your important work. And the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation is your ally in all of this work. And we also are making sure that a new generation of young Americans at the high school, middle school, and college levels understands the history of the 20th century and the still ongoing human rights violations, abuses, tyranny of communist parties today. So thank you, Frank.
We're going to try to make this a little bit interactive at the risk of getting off schedule, but we could take one quick question, if there is one, for Marion Smith. Yes, sir. Robert Lee? Do we have a microphone? Stand by just 1 second, please.
I know that you are planning to have a museum built up around National Mall. How is that plan going?
So, in case you didn't hear it, he asked about the museum effort that our foundation is involved with. In 1993, the United States Congress unanimously passed a law authorizing the establishment of our foundation, the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, and since that time it's been a long-standing goal that we establish a museum for the victims of communism here in Washington, D.C. The 2007 dedication of the Victims of Communism Memorial was an important step in the direction of the memory projects that ultimately will include the museum. You may have seen we have received a few large gifts in support of the museum, and we are actively working to fundraise for the museum, and we're fairly far along in the planning process, and there'll be more public information coming out about that very soon. But since 1917, 100 years, some 40 countries that have experienced Communist Party rule, a death toll of over 100 million. In the case of the Soviet Union, in the case of Cambodia, 25% of the population killed by their government as a matter of policy in peacetime. With the language of equality, communist parties brought to the world a new form of modern slavery. And that is a history that must be known. The ideas of Marxism must be discredited, and communism and socialism, even socialism with Chinese characteristics, needs to be seen as an ideology, a system of government that belongs on the ash heap of history, and not in any sense a system that should define the 21st century. Yeah. Thanks. Appreciate it.
Well, speaking of the ambitions of the Chinese Communist Party, I'm very pleased to say we have a distinguished historian and author, Dr. Bradley Thayer, with us. He has recently become a professor at the University of Texas in San Antonio. He is the author of numerous books on the subjects of what the Chinese are up to, among other topics. And he's agreed to join us today to talk quickly about Xi Jinping and communist fundamentalism, and why another Tiananmen Square is possible. Brad, welcome.
Indeed. Thank you, Frank. Thank you for that warm introduction, and I'd like to thank Brian Kennedy, of course, and Frank Gaffney, and all of those who made this gathering possible, but also those who have supported in every way this committee and its important work. I'd like to talk to you this afternoon about Xi Jinping and communist fundamentalism, why another Tiananmen Square massacre is possible. As we commemorate the 30th anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre, it's important not only to remember the terrible tragedy and the viciousness and determination of the Communist Party of China to stay in power, but also to recognize 4 additional elements. First, this was a terrible lost opportunity for China. Secondly, to understand the lessons drawn by both Deng Xiaoping and Xi Jinping. Thirdly, to recognize that it could happen again in Xi Jinping's China. And fourth, it's a seminal event that draws a sharp distinction between the West and China under the Communist Party. And in a certain and very direct respect, it made the rule of Xi Jinping possible. In the late spring of 1989, millions of people went to the streets in Beijing to demand political reforms. It was perhaps the largest peaceful protest in China since the Chinese Communist Party came to power in 1949, and perhaps even the largest event in the history of modern China. What was unique about the pro-democracy movement that gathered in Tiananmen Square was that the protesters came from within and outside of the Communist Party structure. They sought to make China a modern country with democracy and the rule of law. Famously, as Marian Smith observed, they constructed the 30-foot plaster-covered goddess of democracy statue in the center of Tiananmen Square, which recalled, of course, the Statue of Liberty and Delacroix's Liberty Leading the People. Of course, Deng Xiaoping refused their demands and instead ordered the People's Liberation Army to march into Beijing and retake Tiananmen Square from the student protesters. The party would not tolerate a challenge to its rule, and the PLA attack resulted in the deaths of thousands of innocent people. As we've heard this afternoon, the exact casualties are still unknown due to the Communist Party of China's deliberate cover-up and censorship of the information concerning the event. Of course, 1989 was a momentous year. In the Soviet bloc, pro-democracy movements, at first in Poland and in Hungary, triggered a chain reaction that ultimately led to the collapse of Soviet satellites and later the Soviet Union itself. In contrast, the June 4th massacre is a tragedy for modern China, which took the country in a very unfortunate direction. The real cost of the massacre was that China lost the opportunity to become what China has been, and indeed should be again, a great, enlightened, and sublime power. Deng drew seminal lessons from the collapse of communism in the USSR and its Eastern Bloc allies. Accordingly, he recognized that it was the Communist Party of China's economic performance that would provide legitimacy for the party. And this solution, of course, worked for decades. But heady economic growth is waning in China, and consequently the party's legitimacy is also vulnerable to challenge. Xi drew a very different lesson from the Soviet Union's collapse. He believes the Soviet party leaders' communist ideals and convictions wavered, certainly after the death of the last true Bolshevik, Mikhail Suslov, in 1982. Those who ran the Politburo lost their faith in communism, and so they lost control of its ideology and ultimately their power. Xi's solution is what may only be considered communist fundamentalism, the desire to return to traditional Leninism and Maoism as political ordering principles, to enforce its ideology and require a resolute commitment to it in order to ensure that the party's control of political thought is maintained and that there will be no crises of faith among the adherents of communism in China. No questioning of the communist fundamentalist beliefs. As a communist fundamentalist, Xi understands that to preserve the party and its control requires tightly controlling the internet to police thought and expression. It dictates absolute loyalty from the military to ensure regime stability. And many measures that he's implemented, including the use of high-tech surveillance, have turned China into a super police state with little room for dissent within it. Xi Jinping's mistakes and gross human rights abuses, such as suppressing millions of Uyghurs and Kazakhs, ensures that a random event may trigger civil disobedience and in turn may evolve into another Tiananmen protest. In sum, a new spark could occur at any time, and as an acolyte of Lenin and Mao, Xi's natural proclivity is to use force and violence to maintain power at all costs. This also means that he'll use any mechanism to crush dissent. The probability of repeating the Tiananmen strategy under Xi is far higher than under his predecessors in post-Deng China. Another Tiananmen Square massacre would be a humanitarian disaster, dangerous for China and for the global community. 30 years ago, the U.S. missed a historic chance to intervene to prevent the bloody crackdown in its wake, to labor to weaken the party's chokehold over China. Mark Twain is purported to have written that history does not repeat itself, but it does in fact rhyme. This lamentable past provides a valuable lesson for the United States and its allies to prepare for history's rhyme, should it occur, and act against repression. Finally, Tiananmen is significant because it illuminates the differences between the West and China. It can be said that Stalin was responsible for both saving the Soviet Union through his totalitarianism and ensuring its collapse. His brutal policies, including forced hyper-industrialization, allowed the Soviet Union to defeat the Nazi invasion. But in the long run, the totalitarian system that he created could not change and ultimately collapsed. Likewise, in one respect, Deng saved the Communist Party of China in its rule by brutally crushing the pro-democracy movement in 1989. But ultimately, by so doing, he made Xi possible. Xi may greatly damage or destroy the party's control of China due to his communist fundamentalist beliefs and his reckless ambition. Once the U.S. understands the objectives and ruthlessness that he possesses, that he is in fact a communist fundamentalist, it can recognize the clear danger he presents to U.S. national security interests and to international stability. In the domestic realm, Xi's very clear, calling for the strengthening of the Communist Party's chokehold over the country. His faith in himself and the Communist Party of China is absolute. Internationally, his actions are equally dangerous, supporting China's aggressive expansion in South China Sea and elsewhere, threatened to use of force to seize and occupy Taiwan, backed authoritarian regimes from Russia to Venezuela to Zimbabwe, and expanded China's influence and control over less developed states through the Belt and Road Initiative. He is the global leader of opposition to the U.S. position in international politics and the present international order, which has kept peace for over a generation and provided prosperity to many millions, including within China. Xi's vision for global politics is one where China is supreme and international order is decidedly illiberal. From Xi's speeches, particularly his speech to the 19th Party Congress, his intent of defeating the U.S. is transparent, as is his desire to replace the dominance in Western values in global politics with those of the values of the Chinese Communist parties. So he's a clear danger to the Chinese people due to his repression, and he's an equal danger to the present world order as a result of his determination to destroy it. To change the situation, much needs to be done. Let me just touch on very briefly two measures. First, Washington needs to reaffirm its commitment to Western values, political ideology of liberalism, and the principles that stand in positive light when compared to Chinese oppressive government. Second, the Chinese people must be supported in their effort to avoid a return to the past, ruled by another communist fundamentalist. Democratic forces, both within and outside the system, must stand up to Xi's dictatorship. And the global community should also send a strong signal to the Chinese people about its preference for a stable and peaceful leader to lead that great nation. For millennia, Chinese civilization was unrivaled in its historical stability, elegance, and sophistication. The Chinese people should be led by a person who's the equal of that greatness rather than by a despot. China has left its political dark ages behind. We can define the period in Chinese history from the First Opium War to the end of Maoism as its dark ages. It has entered a period of a renaissance, where you've seen the rebirth of Chinese power in every respect. The key question for us to consider today is whether China will enter a political enlightenment. Sadly, with Xi's leadership and the party's leadership, it's very unlikely that China will reach any form of political enlightenment as long as the party rules. Well, thank you very much for your attention this afternoon, and my thanks again to Frank and to Brian for the opportunity. Thank you, Frank.
Dr. Thayer has agreed to take a question if there is one. Anybody? Yes, sir. Marion?
Would you just give your thoughts on Xi's use of Maoism, Marxism as an ideology within the party? And do you think that he's a true believer?
Marion, thank you very much for that important question. I think that his use of Maoism as well as Leninism, obviously, if you will, the grandfather of the Chinese Communist Party, is frequent and I believe fervent in his belief. I truly believe that he has looked and studied the collapse of the Soviet Union and its Eastern Bloc allies assiduously. That case has been very well studied by them, and they're determined not to repeat their errors. The importance or the abandonment of ideology as legitimating structure for the Soviet Communist Party was seen to be a fundamental mistake, and they're determined not to use that again. So I truly believe that he is a communist fundamentalist, he is a Leninist, he is a Maoist, and he truly believes in the value of despotism and of crushing and not permitting any political dissent within China to sustain his power. And that's a terrible situation for China in which to be. Thank you so much.
I should have mentioned that Brad Thayer is a member of the Committee on the Present Danger. We're very proud to have him as such, and pleased as well to welcome to our podium a man who is actually in the process of co-authoring with Dr. Thayer a new book on the coming war with China, I believe it's called. His name is Lianchao Han. He is the co-founder and vice president of the Independent Federation of Chinese Students and Scholars, and a very active participant in this committee's programs, and we're delighted to have him back to talk a little bit about the CCP's regime resilience and civil resistance post-Tiananmen. Lianchao.
Good afternoon. On the eve of the 30th anniversary of Tiananmen Square massacre, I would like to thank all of you gathered here to commemorate the fallen and reflect upon the event to help China move forward. I'm sure you have heard the Chinese defense minister's remarks about Tiananmen Square massacre. He insisted it was a riot and the crackdown was correct and justified. Of course, that's bogus. But it indicates, as Brad just said, that Xi Jinping's regime has fully entrenched to use force again without hesitation to murder anyone in the way of his one-party rule. So, Tiananmen Square massacre is still highly relevant. It is worthwhile for us to take a look at the dynamics in post-Tiananmen China. After the massacre, many, including myself, were too optimistic about China's future. Despite the bloody crackdown, we believed that within a few years, the communist regime would fall. But 30 years later, the CCP has not only survived the crisis and remained in power, but has reached unprecedented levels of global influence. How does the CCP regime become so resilient? In my view, the CCP learned from the June 4th massacre and made preventing the recurrence of the 1989 pro-democracy movement its top priority to avoid regime collapse. Immediately after Tiananmen Square massacre, Deng Xiaoping directed the regime to use two-hands approach to handle the crisis. On the one hand, it greatly strengthened the security apparatus using military, the police, the judicial system, and the propaganda machine to relentlessly crack down on dissidents and purge internal rivalry. They purchased lots of anti-riots equipment, interrogation technologies from the West. Later, built a vast stability maintenance system to nip the buds of opposition, and it immediately stopped all political system reform. On the other hand, Deng Xiaoping redirected China to focus on economic development and continue the implementation of economic reforms to reassert the regime's legitimacy, justify the bloody crackdown. Trade and economic development were carried out as a matter of deliberate regime survival policy. In the aftermath of the Tiananmen Square massacre, the party encouraged the masses to forget about politics and their own freedom and dedicate themselves to making money. At the same time, the region also became more adaptive with diversified and more sophisticated governance means, resulting in greater control of state power, then also curtailed temporarily the party president's profiteering activities to quell the public anger. Deng Xiaoping's strategy worked well. West countries dropped their economic sanctions, and massive amounts of international capital and technology flew in and stabilized the region while exploiting the low wages and poor conditions of the Chinese workers. Economic grew rapidly, which indeed raised many boats. It is true that China's growth has been one of the most important factors enabling government control over the population, despite never resolving the underlying social political issues. One of these issues is corruption. When China opened to outside world, Deng Xiaoping had instructed the regime to allow riches to flow to a small sum of people first. To do that, China adopted a dual-track economic system in which the government introduced certain elements of capitalism by allowing private enterprises to have limited access to certain sectors, all the while maintaining socialist economy as its core. This dual-track system allows for the privileged class to become rich at expenses of common citizenry and has become the hotbed for systematic corruption in China. At the same time, allow the state to control the wealth created by the Chinese people. Governments at all levels carried out the fast-growing policy in a predatory manner. Officials forcefully demolished people's homes, took their assets, closed their factories, ignored environmental impact, created injustice, unfairness, general discontent in the entire nation. This resulted in a revival of rampant profiteering, almost exclusively enjoined by the presidents and the government officials. It triggered even much broader systematic corruption than that of the pre-Tiananmen Square era, turning China into a totalitarian kleptocracy. In turn, civil resistance has been on the rise, despite regime's unprecedented repression. Civil resistance took many forms. Over the span of the past 30 years, it has emerged in the form of a remembrance of the June 4th massacre to seek reverse of the regime's verdict on the 1989 pro-democracy movement. The pro-democracy activists on China's mainland also realized the importance of having political party on which a viable opposition could be built. Indeed, they have tried repeatedly to establish their own party. The Tibetan and Uyghur uprising in 2008 also appeared to take the CCP internal security system by surprise. Civil resistance continued through 2008 as activists associated with the Chapter 08 movement joined together on the 60th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Chapter 08, originally a manifesto co-authored by Nobel Prize winner Liu Xiaobo, demanded constitutional democracy and the political reform to ensure human rights for the Chinese people. The charter received more than 10,000 signatures. In early 2011, inspired by the Arab Spring, Chinese pro-democracy activists worked hard to attempt launch intensive protests known as Jasmine Revolution in dozens of Chinese cities, resulting in widespread tension among the CCP regime. The New Citizen Movement was another major political and social campaign took place. It promoted peaceful transition towards democracy, constitutionalism, advocated for equal education rights for migrant workers' children in the larger cities, engaged in citizen activism under the banner Freedom, Justice, and Love. Between 2012-2013, as part of the movement, new citizen groups went to the street to demand that government officials publicly disclose their assets and income. In addition, the rights defense movement presented a special challenge to the regime because human rights lawyers armed with the Chinese laws and with the internet, they could reach out to the public for organized support and help victims of human rights abuse to get justice. In fact, internet aided in the spread of democratic idea and raised rights awareness in China. It became China's virtual public square and provided a platform for people to criticize CCP leaders, to question and challenge their one-party rules, and to expose corruption and social injustice. Internet actually allowed Chinese individuals and the community to organize through social media and collectively push for change. Using internet, the rights lawyers won many cases. Of course, all above civil resistance campaigns failed, were suppressed by the Chinese regime. The Chinese regime has become even more dictatorial and more repressive. Under Xi Jinping, the regime has entered a mood of bottom line thinking. That is, all civil resistance activities, no matter how small, must take seriously, as if the regime's survival depends on it. With this mentality, the Xi Jinping regime has weaponized mass surveillance for mind control, information control, population control to ensure its regime's security. Over the years, it has been spent enormous money to build a total surveillance system. Consists of 3 main platforms, Skynet, Safe City, and Sharp Eyes, that target both cities and rural areas. China is about to complete its installation of 2.7 cameras around the country with the 50 million cameras that has a visual recognition capability. The surveillance system integrates other big data and AI technologies such as banking data, mobile payment apps, WeChat, social credit score system, third generation ID card, biometric info, Great Firewall, mobile phones, televisions, and other surveillance hardware and software. The totality of this allowed the CCP to weave a tight net that no one can escape their watch. It has effectively silenced the voice of political and civil activists in public space. But silence does not mean submission and consent. In fact, Chinese civil society not only exists, but becomes stronger. And the people's rights awareness has significantly increased. The undercurrents are surging everywhere in China. Any random event could trigger another Tiananmen protest at any moment. Finally, I would like to point out that American politicians and financial elite helped the CCP regime survive Tiananmen Square massacre. Today, American companies, Wall Street, and universities are still helping Xi Jinping build this pervasive surveillance system to suppress the Chinese people, which is a real shame. A half century ago, Professor Sutton wrote a book called Wall Street and Rise of Hitler, in which he collected sufficient evidence to show that Wall Street elite, quote, do not journey to Washington as lobbyists and administrators in order to serve the United States. They are in Washington to serve their own profit-maximizing interests. Their purpose is not to further competitive free market economy, but to manipulate a politicized regime, call it what you will, to their own advantage, unquote. The Wall Street elite aided Hitler's rise, which led to the World War II disaster. And they're still helping Xi Jinping, or Chinese people call Hitler. So let's not forget the lessons of history. Thank you very much.
A question for Lian Chao? Yes, ma'am. There is a microphone. It needs to be a little more centrally located, I think.
Is it on? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Lian Chao, I want to thank you for all of the great things that you've done for your people.
Thank you.
And also for your hard work here in Washington. There's something that some of us are aware of, being Washingtonians, and some are not. And I'd like to bring to everybody's attention something that happened on June 22nd, 1989. There was something known as the Tiananmen Square Park Authorization Act. It was set up by my now late husband. It was a piece of property that came about when he asked me one day at breakfast, how do we fix this? How do we get back at them? And I said, again, being a Washingtonian, that it's really interesting because there's a little square right across from the Chinese embassy. So perhaps what you might be able to do, being the chairman of the Energy Committee and so forth, you might be able to figure out a way that you can rename the square Tiananmen Square and leave it that way. And it was done. So recently, some of us went to see what had been done or not done. The sign has, of course, disappeared. The encroachment of the embassy appears to have almost incorporated the square into their property. This has been done deliberately, obviously. And also, I asked each one of you, and especially Marion, I was really interested in what you had to say today, to figure out how the hell we get that thing renamed again, Tiananmen Square. So that's what I have to say. Thank you very much, Lian Chao.
Thank you. I think that's a great idea. Senator Wallop used to be, I worked with him. He was a strong supporter for the pro-democracy movement in China. He actually hosted Tiananmen Square student leader Chai Lin to intern in his office. I think it's a great idea to revive that place, because we have so many protests in front of the Chinese embassy, the Tiananmen Square, and Chinese government so afraid, so they moved the embassy. But that place is still there, and they built the Chinese embassy. I think is another branch of their residence in the old embassy. It would be a great idea. We can officially name that place as Tiananmen Square. Thank you, French.
Thank you, French Wallop. Also, Lian Chao, thank you particularly for both calling attention to this police state apparatus that is being now not only employed against the Chinese people, but also against the people of other nations as well. Also, for highlighting a topic that our colleague Roger Robinson will talk about shortly in terms of Wall Street underwriting these kinds of activities. Next up, I'm very pleased to say we have a woman who has literally devoted her life to trying to raise the awareness about one of the most horrific and comprehensive forms of human rights abuse imaginable. And that is something that we've coined a term for: the womb police. The enforcement of the one child or two child or some child limit that the Chinese Communist Party and a few others, I must say, have been using to horrific effect, now of a great and terrible demographic consequence for their own people. Her name is Reggie Littlejohn. She is a lawyer by training, but has become the president of a marvelous organization, Women's Rights Without Frontiers. Reggie, welcome.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you, Brian Kennedy. Thank you for the committee on the present danger for having this event, which is extremely important, extremely timely, particularly at this juncture in history. And I am honored to speak about one of the most egregious instances of the CCP's unrestricted war against freedom, the coercive enforcement of China's one-child policy. Over the past 39 years, China has waged a war against women. The CCP has functioned as womb police, declaring life or death over every pregnancy in China. They claim that they have prevented 400 million births. Now that number, 400 million, is greater than the entire population of the United States and the entire population of Canada combined. How did they prevent these births? Through forced abortion, forced sterilization, and even infanticide. The coercive enforcement of China's one-child policy is the greatest violation of women's rights, and indeed the greatest violation of human rights on the earth today and in the history of the world, simply because of the massive numbers involved. It has been estimated that 65 million people died as a result of Mao Zedong's creation of a socialist China through the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, and other means. This number is mind-numbing, and it makes him the greatest mass murderer of the 20th century. Yet even that number is eclipsed by the 400 million lives prevented by the one-child policy. So I would add to that 65 million, 400 million. So you get 465 million deaths due to the Chinese Communist Party. The two-child policy has not stopped this slaughter. The new rule is every couple is allowed to have 2 children. What does that mean in practice? That means you have to be married. You have to be part of a couple in order to have a child. So that leaves single women still at risk of forced abortion and third pregnancies also have been forcibly aborted. Now, there have been a whole series of unintended consequences that have caused immeasurable suffering in China and falling like a series of dark dominoes as a result of the one-child policy. Number one, forced abortion. This has continued even since the two-child policy was instituted on January 1st of 2016. In November of 2018, NPR reported that there was a Kazakh woman who was forcibly aborted of her third child. What happened is this. She was marrying somebody in Kazakhstan. She wanted to give up her Chinese citizenship. She crossed the border into China. To give up her Chinese citizenship, they discovered she was pregnant with a third child. That's legal in Kazakhstan, but not in China. So they forcibly aborted her third child. November 2018. Forced sterilization. What do I mean by forced sterilization? As Frank mentioned, I am an attorney. I was practicing law in San Francisco. I represented a Chinese refugee in her case for political asylum. She was persecuted as a Christian and also forcibly sterilized. In her case, what it meant was that cadres came to her door daily trying to convince her to be sterilized. She refused because people in her village would have their entire health ruined by these sterilizations. So finally, they just physically picked her up, carried her out of her home screaming and crying, held her down to a table, cut her open, tied her fallopian tubes. This is all without anesthesia. And as a result, they ruined her health. She had chronic back pain, chronic migraines, chronic abdominal pain for the rest of her life, or at least until I represented her, which was many years later. Okay, so forced abortion, forced sterilization, unintended consequences. Gendercide, the sex-selective abortion of baby girls. China has had the worst sex ratio of any country in the world, and it has not stopped under the two-child policy. In fact, in some ways, it's almost become worse. We don't have the next, they're going to have another census in 2020, so we don't have the current numbers, but I will tell you an incident. This was in Anhui province in July 2017, so this was under the two-child policy. A couple had a daughter. They were fine. They were satisfied. We have our kid. Along comes the two-child policy in 2017, and then the idea is, oh, wait, we have a girl, let's get a boy. The husband forced his wife to abort 4 baby girls in a year. When she became ill, he divorced her, and then she died. And I can tell you many other instances of gendercide that have happened. This is the thing. Even under the two-child policy, there's son preference. We can go into that if you want to ask a question about why. But people will let their if the first kid is a girl, they'll let her live. But then they're saying, oh, but we can have a boy on the second child. So second daughters are still very vulnerable to sex-selective abortion. That has led to a gender imbalance where there are now an estimated 37 million more men than women living in China. And that has led to human trafficking and sexual slavery. So, for example, in the June 2018 Trafficking in Persons report put out by our State Department, China was listed as a Tier 3 nation, one of the worst offenders in the world. How do you get to be a Tier 3 nation? Number one, you have to have a terrible record on human trafficking, and number two, you need to not be doing anything about it or not enough about it, okay? Why does China not take more action against human trafficking? Could it be the 37 million quote-unquote excess males that they have? What are they going to do with all these frustrated men if they don't have trafficked women? It's really a sick calculation that they're making. And by the way, I know that something that is important to Frank and me, and I think everybody here, what are they going to do with the 37 million excess males? Does this pose some kind of international security risk? Wouldn't it be convenient to put them in the military? Okay, so China made an adjustment from a one-child policy to a two-child policy. The entire infrastructure of coercion is still in place to enforce the two-child policy, and they did it not because they were repenting of their human rights violations. No, they did it because they're facing a demographic disaster. Their workforce has decreased. They're facing a senior tsunami. And they're in such a difficult situation right now with respect to seniors that over the last 20 years, senior suicide has skyrocketed 500%. Why is that? Because the one-child policy has destroyed the family structure of China. They used to have large families. It was not a problem to help the seniors as they got old. Now they have small families. There's no one left to take care of grandma and grandpa, especially grandma. When grandpa dies, there's just... China has the highest female suicide rate in the world. Also, 590 women a day kill themselves in China. In the Chinese countryside, 3 times the number of women as men kill themselves. And seniors, and especially senior widows, are killing themselves. All right. He says I have to finish up. So why does China continue with any kind of coercive enforcement of population control when they need more babies? Okay, I believe it's social control masquerading as population control. The one-child policy touches everyone in China, and it is an instrument of terror. The Wound Police function as domestic terrorists. So what can we do about it? Number one, Women's Rights Without Frontiers is the only organization in the world that has boots on the ground inside of China, actively saving baby girls and abandoned widows. Number two, we can keep up the pressure, the international pressure. The CCP said that international criticism was one of the reasons they are thinking about abandoning coercive birth control. And then number three, we can use the Global Magnitsky Act, which authorizes the U.S. government to sanction human rights offenders, freeze their assets, and ban them from entering the United States. And I think that this is a great way to send a message to China that we're not going to take this anymore. Thank you.
Would there be a question for Reggie Littlejohn? Marion?
Thank you, Reggie. Could you speak just briefly about how the party or how the government presents this policy? Obviously, there's a lot about the techniques, the consequences of the policy that they don't admit, they don't acknowledge. But in terms of public statements or the general public, how do they defend this policy? How do they present it as a social good?
Well, I mean, typically what they will do, and they've changed their rhetoric over the last couple years because they've had to, but what they have said is, look at us. We have 1.4 billion people. We have just too big of a population. We need to be able to control it. Well, yes, they have the biggest population in the world, and yes, their population is growing. You want to know why it's growing? Because the seniors are living longer. It's the elderly that are growing. And they don't address the fact that they need more of a young population to support the elderly population, and they need more girls. Now they have realized that actually that this is the case, and they're desperate for babies. And this is just another form of coercion, trying to force people. Every couple that is allowed to have 2 children must have 2 children. I mean, they're pressuring people to have babies when they don't want them. But the last thing I want to say is this: I believe that China is going to announce either that they're moving to a 3-child policy or that they are that they will allow all couples to have as many children as they want. Watch the language. Because if they say all couples are allowed to have as many children as they want, that still leaves single women open to forced abortion, and it still leaves the entire infrastructure in place. They need to be saying everyone can have as many kids as they want, not just all couples. Thank you.
I can't impress upon you enough how horrible this apparatus that Reggie talked about is. When you think about literally women having to be inspected, their wombs inspected with regularity to ensure that they aren't pregnant, or they are but not impermissibly. It's staggering, and it is about control. I think Reggie's absolutely right. Thank you for that. We're going to talk now about a geography to which the Chinese are trying to export much of which we've just been hearing about. Whether it's the authoritarianism and indeed totalitarianism, or whether it's their socialism, communism, whatever you wish to call it, with Chinese characteristics. It is part and parcel of what is being done with this so-called Belt and Road Initiative of Xi Jinping. And I met the other day, thanks to our friend Faith McDonald, with Akol Nyok Akol Dok from South Sudan, who is working hard to try to help his country overcome the effects of jihadism and imperialism from Sudan, Khartoum, but also much of what is being enabled now by the Chinese Communist Party. Akol happens, among other qualities, to have been Mr. Africa International 2016. So we have a handsome specimen here as well as a leader of the new South Sudan. Akol, please come on up.
Okay, you guys hear me? Okay, thank you for the introduction. As you said, my name is Akol Nyok Akol Dok. I am a graduate of Iowa State University, and I currently live in South Sudan, where I do sort of policy consultant and different work with the business and public sector. Africa. When you think of China, you don't necessarily think of Africa. When you think of United States and Africa, Africa is largely neglected. But there's different Africa that the world doesn't see. The Africa you see may be an Africa of poverty, an Africa of destruction, but there's an Africa of the future. So the future is Africa. Africa will account for more than 54% of the 2.4 billion global population growth in the coming decades. And the UN predicts that between 2015 and 2030, Africa will add 1.3 billion people, doubling its current population. On top of that, Africa remains largely underdeveloped. So its resources, its natural resources, capabilities are all up for grabs. And this is what China is doing. In 2018, President Xi Jinping invited all African heads of state to China, and known as the Beijing Summit Forum on China-African Cooperation. And at this summit, Xi Jinping promised billions of US dollars, up to $100 billion, to support African nations' developmental needs. These needs include infrastructure, economic development, loans. But the catch is that these opportunities have to be done by Chinese companies. The example I give is that my country is currently engaged in a deal with the Chinese, whereas if they're going to build a road about 200 kilometers, and the Chinese will be given 30,000 barrels of oil per day. But the condition is that they have to use a Chinese company, Chinese bank, the Chinese bring in all the manpower, and what do? We get a mediocre road, we don't get training, we don't get capacity, and on top of that, this road is going to collapse and we'll be in debt. So, why is this important? What the Chinese are dominating Africa, and how they're dominating Africa is because the U.S. and Western nations approach. The Chinese play to the narrative that we as the Chinese, we're not like the Westerns, we're not like the Americans. We're not going to intervene into your politics. We're not going to sanction you. We're not going to do this. We're going to work with you. We're going to see you as partners. And so they sell the narrative to African leaders that if you go to the United States, they won't give you money to build roads, to build schools. They'll accuse you of being dictators, human rights abusers. They'll sanction you guys. And we're here. And there's even examples I give where there's some South Sudanese and companies, friends of mine, who say, hey, I want to purchase American equipment to do business in South Sudan. But because there's economic sanctions, I have to go to China. So if you want to buy a new rig is about $15 million. So if I reached out to an American company and said, hey, I want to buy a rig so I can start drilling oil in South Sudan and counter the Chinese, I'll be restricted. But what do? I go to Beijing. So this foreign policy approach is dangerous because what the United States is doing. Yes, there are issues in Africa, but the United States should seek to become partners with Africa to counter China. Because what's happening now is China is offering African nations debts because nobody's knocking at the door except African nation. You're an African president, and your people, they need roads, they need infrastructure, they need hospitals, they want development. And you go to the British, you go to the United States, and they tell you that you have bad human rights records, you need to do this, you need to do that. You don't want to hear that. So what do? You go to China, you go to Beijing, and Beijing says, of course, we'll give you whatever you want to give you. What do you need? Well, I want to build a railroad, such as what's happening in Kenya. They built a railroad from Nairobi to Mombasa port. and they finance it through the Chinese Exim Bank. And these loans are predatory loans. Now, China has seized the international airport of Zambia's capital, Lusaka. China has seized the national electricity company. China is even on pace to seize the port of Mombasa because of loans. Why is this important? The Belt and Road Initiative that you hear is actually a way to debt trap African nations. And when they debt trap these nations, they seize their assets. So when you do a Belt and Road Initiative and you go to 54 African countries and you say, we're going to build you roads, railroads, and infrastructure, we'll give you debts. These could have no choice. And you know for sure that some of these people cannot pay these debts. What's going to happen? China essentially is going to be controlling Africa. And when the U.S. turns its eyes, it's going to be too late because these African nations have signed these agreements. What Africa needs essentially is economic development institution. And it cannot get it from China. Africans, they don't go to China. Me, as an African, I spent time in the United States. I see the values of America and how these values have made America transform and have made the West transform. But I don't see a lot of Africans go living in China. You don't find a lot of Africans speaking Chinese. But you find a lot of Africans speaking English. So the recommendation is that the United States needs to do a full review on its policy in Africa and consider China as a threat. China is truly a threat. As we speak right now, in South Sudan, you guys have noticed, the Chinese are building the road. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs building in our country was built by the Chinese. And in the building, you have a flag of China and a flag of South Sudan. This is our Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And if you've been to Juba, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is right opposite to the United States Embassy. So you can kind of see the juxtaposition of that. Our president has created a China desk in the office of the president in order to develop relationships. The Chinese are very active in Africa in developing relationships. The Chinese are constantly giving out scholarships, phony scholarships. Many of these students are promised master's degree, bachelor's degree, but they don't get the necessary training that they need. And when they come back to South Sudan or come back to Africa, who's controlling the economy? It's the Chinese. Do you think a Chinese is going to send a Chinese back to China and employ an African? Of course not. And when they come back, as we speak in South Sudan, there are oil field workers who don't know English but only speak Chinese in South Sudan. So when the South Sudanese gets training in China in specified 5 years and comes back and says, I'm ready to work, the Chinese say, well, he's not qualified enough. Why? Because he doesn't speak Chinese. So what is happening is that the Chinese are having a heyday in Africa, and something needs to be done about it. And this thing is very destructive. So what we want to do is a review of this, and let's see what are ways that the U.S. could partner with countries in Africa to promote economic development and institutions and counter China. Thank you.
Any question? Sasha?
Well, I think I can speak.
No, they can't hear you.
Questions that actually involved in a few cases 10 years ago. African unions complained that the Chinese companies in Africa first only in the beginning only hired the workers from China, and they put the workers in the compound and not allowing them to contact African workers. And are they hiring African workers now?
No, on limited scale. And most of the African workers that are hired is through push from the government. But the Chinese themselves, they don't hire African workers. To the point where they bring cooks, drivers, menial labor staff from China to Africa to do some of the work.
This is colonialism.
Yeah, it's colonialism.
Thank you, Akol, very much. It may be new colonialism, but it's still colonialism. You just heard momentarily, a moment ago, from Sasha Gong. We're going to ask her to come up and introduce our next speaker, Robert Lee. Sasha is a member, again, I'm very pleased to say, of the Committee on the Present Danger of China. She spent quite a number of years after she extricated herself from China, where she was a political prisoner, educated here, and worked in various positions in the Voice of America until she encountered some of the difficulties that Robert is also going to be speaking about in terms of Chinese influence operations inside our own country and indeed our government. Sasha, welcome.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you. before I'm going to, I will introduce my very dear colleague and good friend, Robert Lee, who actually stole the name of a great Virginian general. And I want to recognize my other very dear friend and colleague, Hu Chenzhang, who served as Guang Cheng's interpreter before. Hu Cheng actually is still working in Voice of America, but he got demoted. He's one of the greatest anchor and greatest journalists in the Chinese-speaking world. Yeah. And, well, it is a very well-known event that on April 19, 2017, I was leading a team to interview a whistleblower from China who want to expose corruption in China. He's a billionaire, high-ranking, operative in a way. And he had a lot of information. The Chinese government already targeted him in the Chinese media for 2 years. So I thought I would be giving him a chance to balance the news. No, the Chinese government, actually the Chinese embassy, the Chinese government, and involved in Interpol to intervene. Guess what happened? Voice of America, well, I worked in, they demanded to cancel the entire interview, to shut this guy up. And as the leader of that team, I said no. So in the middle of the interview, the top management came to someone, said, you have to pull the plug. It's a live show, doesn't matter, you pull the plug. That's the guy. He was in charge of the internet operation, but at that time they came to him, said, well, pull the plug. And he said, no, you have to give me a written order. They refused to give the written order because they did not want to leave any written order. So for that one reason, he got fired 3 weeks ago. I'm very sorry, Robert, but I think God intended you to play a much better role. Come here.
Okay. What an introduction. I'd like to show my thanks to Frank, to the Chairman Kennedy, and to a Committee on the Present Danger China to remember Tiananmen massacre. We want the whole world to know that we'll never forget. Last Friday, Twitter suspended hundreds of accounts. These accounts had a couple of things in common. First of all, the users of the accounts are Chinese, living inside and outside of China. And they tweet using the Chinese language. Second of all, the accounts are all critical of the Chinese government and Chinese Communist Party, the CCP. As for the date of the suspension, last Friday was May 31st, 4 days before June 4th, 2019, the 30th anniversary of Tiananmen Square massacre. Some have called these suspensions the Twitter massacre. I happen to manage one account which is within the suspended account. That's not my personal account. I manage it on behalf of a group of people. And Twitter explained that they may have made some mistakes in their routine checkup. I just got a Twitter message 40 minutes ago, and there is an explanation. A little background. We have automated systems that find and remove spam accounts, and yours was flagged by our systems as spam by mistake. Reports regarding your account submitted by other users did not play a role in these actions. What a convenient excuse. Think about it. Twitter suspends the accounts of users using Chinese language and being critical of the Chinese government 4 days before the 30th anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre. The timing is impeccable. Can we really believe that this is simply a coincidence? I must be very naive. If this happened in China, where censorship is the norm, then nothing would be amiss. But this happened here, in the United States of America, the leader of the democratic and free world. That's not normal. That should not be normal. Since when has suppression of freedom of speech become normal here? This is what I want to stress today. We are being attacked from the inside. We're so vulnerable because the attacker is one of our own. And we are being backstabbed. These attackers could be big corporations like Twitter, or high-ranking government officials like the head of the Voice of America, VOA, and Board of Broadcasting Governors. Now it's called the U.S. Agency of Global Media, right? Okay, I'm not familiar with it. I'm still using BBG, who caved in to Chinese pressure and abruptly stopped an interview with Guo Wengui in 2017. That's the incident Sasha just mentioned just now in the introduction. These organizations are our own, and they have a direct impact on our freedom of speech. These incidents have shown that freedom is in imminent danger. Twitter denied that China had any involvement in this massive suspension, just like the Voice of America and BBG denied that Chinese pressure led to the suspension of Guo Wengui's interview. Who wouldn't deny that kind of accusation? But then, why are people, including me, highly suspicious of China's involvement? Because China uses carrot and stick to cast influence here. Thanks to big Western corporations, including most American corporations, the Chinese Communist Party now has enough money to influence many areas of the United States, more than you can imagine. On one occasion, the Chinese business opportunities made someone delivered a letter from Xi Jinping, the president of China, directly into the White House, the top of our administration, asking our president to deport a person the Chinese government wants, Guo Wengui, of course. If you look into any of the projects related to China of all the major think tanks and universities here in the States, you will see Chinese money backing them. China offers all kinds of incentives, business opportunities, donations, investment, access to vast resources for research, etc., etc. You name it. We know that power corrupts. We also know that money corrupts too. And with so much money at its disposal, China has developed a record of successfully influencing American decisions. Ordinary Chinese citizens could be thrown into jail for having a Twitter account. But all major state-owned Chinese media outlets have a huge presence on Twitter. CCTV has nearly 8 million followers. on Twitter. Xinhua has 23 million followers, even more. People's Daily has nearly 5 million, and China Daily, that's an English newspaper by China, has nearly 2 million. These accounts are ultimately controlled by the propaganda development of the Chinese Communist Party, and they have clearly built a strong presence on an American social media platform. But I guess Twitter has never accidentally suspended those accounts. Hudson Institute, a conservative think tank, claimed that it was the only think tank that didn't take Chinese money. Good for it. Despite the fact that its China experts, fellows, and researchers visited China and cooperated with Chinese counterparts on research projects. In October 2017, Hudson Institute scheduled an event called A Conversation with Guowen Gui on October 4th, 2017, 5 months after VOA cut off its interview with Guowen Gui. One day before the event, they announced that the event was postponed and would be rescheduled. From my research, before the scheduled event, Hudson Institute's website was hacked, possibly by Chinese attackers. The institute got messages from China that the status of visas for its fellows and researchers could be endangered if the event was to go on as scheduled. I heard that at least one of the institute donors took a donation from a Chinese donor and passed that donation to the Hudson Institute. Bingo. That donor demanded the event be canceled. Now, that carrot, in the form of a donation, turned into a stick. I wish this wasn't true, but the event has been postponed for over 18 months. Never rescheduled. That's really a long postponement. When they reschedule the event, if there is such a time ever, I'd like to receive an invitation again, just like I did in 2017. It is not that I'm so interested in the event, but I really hope they honor their words and prove there is really no Chinese money influencing the so-called postponement. By the way, the head of Hudson Institute also happens to be the head of BBG, the agency that was ultimately responsible for the cancellation of VOA's interview with Guowen Gui. Another convenient coincidence. Why do I keep coming back to these U.S. international broadcasting organizations, BBG and VOA? American taxpayers spend about $700 million annually to fund organizations such as BBG and VOA. And these organizations are supposed to promote American policies and exemplify principles of a free press and freedom of speech. Now, how has the Chinese carrot influenced BBG's decisions? I can't be sure. But some vulnerabilities are worth paying attention to. In 2011, the Chinese edition of Steve Jobs' biography was published in China. It was published, I think, in the same year here, and became a bestseller immediately. The concern is the writer of this book was the BBG board chairman at the time. Since 1994, Hollywood has made billions of dollars from exporting movies to China. Now, Chinese money is funding some of the Hollywood's movies. This is the normal business, right? There's only one concern. During 2010 and 2012, the chairman and CEO of Sony Pictures Entertainment, which also owns the Columbia Pictures, was at the same time the interim presiding governor of BBG. Today, a top executive of VOA has a huge family business operation in China. At this very moment. Now, I'm not saying that these top executives have done anything wrong. However, when they face tough decisions about China, can they guarantee that the business benefits that they personally receive from China won't factor in? These are huge conflicts of interest, and we taxpayers can suffer because of them. I always say to evaluate people, you not only listen what they say, you pay more attention to what they do. Every 1 or 2 years, there is a survey of best places to work in federal government, an evaluation given by the federal employees for their own agencies. For years, out of 27 mid-sized federal agencies, BBG has always stayed in the lower quartile. Actually, for quite a few years, BBG was number 1 from the bottom. Out of 415 agency subcomponents, VOA, like its mother agency, has stayed in the lower quartile too, forever. The upper management of VOA rarely gives the director instructions to Mandarin service on what programs to do. Here are a few programs that the top executives of VOA instructed the Mandarin service to produce. The ivory smuggling in Africa. Talk to admissions officers of major U.S. colleges and universities. What major issues come to your mind when you think of China? Don't you think of the South China Sea, the Taiwan issue, cyber attacks, the trade war, human rights abuse, religious persecutions? Why would college admissions be more important than any of those issues when it comes to reporting on China? The top executives of VOA and BBG just don't get it. So, what is the solution? Yes, it's high time we fixed our own problems. So we need to clean our house. We need to eliminate the danger within before we can fight outside forces effectively. What can we do to prevent public platforms like Twitter from wrongdoing, such as the Twitter massacre? I don't have a well-thought solution. Maybe we need to have new laws or amend the old laws to regulate these platforms so freedom of speech and freedom of press can really be practiced without being influenced by China's carrot and stick or anyone else. As for BBG and VOA, the U.S. international broadcasting agencies, we need a total overhaul. If necessary, eliminate them completely and build a new agency. In any case, change must start with a comprehensive overhaul of leadership, as Secretary of State Pompeo suggested to the Congress. We need to locate and hire the leaders with clear and sound international visions, knowledge of American interests and values, and the ability to advance those interests and values around the world with no personal or business interests with China and other current or potential adversaries. Without the complete overhaul of leadership, other structural change won't work. Simply put, we need a few good men and women too. God bless America. Thank you.
Quick question? Does anyone have a question for Robert Lee very quickly? Yes, sir, right here.
Yeah, I basically have two questions.
Just one question, sir.
Oh, okay. So I think we should have a congressional hearing on the Twitter. It's very important. Congress paid a lot of money for the Twitter's revenue.
I totally agree. I think we need to work on legislation to have rules set. So those corporations have to abide by our values, our values of freedom of speech, freedom of press, human rights, and democracy.
Wonderful. Thank you, Robert, very much. Well, at each of our programs to this point, we have had a focus on a particularly important public policy issue. And I'm very pleased to say this will be no exception to that. It is the 5G competition with China. And for those of you who've been tracking these issues, we want to make sure that you check out the really remarkable array of insights and assessments of both the stakes involved and the way ahead that has been provided by our previous speakers. You can find the videos at presentdangerchina.org. Today we have the privilege of being addressed by a man who has been working in this space and, among others, on strategic technologies as an investor, seeking to try to help our country compete successfully against China and ensure that we actually prevail, as President Trump has indicated he's committed to doing, in this very high-stakes competition. His name is Andrew Whitney. He is the CEO of Energy Investment Partners. Welcome, Andrew.
Hello, everyone. It's terrific to be here. Very grateful to Frank and to Brian, obviously, for the opportunity to talk to you all. I've got a fairly broad task here, which is to try and explain where I think we need to go in this 5G space. But to do that, I think it's really important to establish a baseline of knowledge so that people actually understand the actual significance of this 5G thing. Because what you tend to hear about is a lot of kind of doom and gloom and disaster, and I think it would be a lot easier for people to understand the severity of all this and also the types of decisions we need to make if people had a better understanding of the core issues. So I'm going to talk about kind of background, baseline, what is 5G, because nobody ever really defines that when they talk about it, what the threat is, what the problem is, what I think the solution is, and then what we need in order to get to that solution. 5G can be a tremendous asset. It will be a tremendous asset if it's done correctly. It'll be a great resource for opportunity, quality of life. But in order to realize that benefit, it means not giving it away, giving the future away to networks powered by Chinese equipment. So today I want to cover some core concepts, a little bit of a kind of a decent grounding in all this, and address a communications issue, literally and figuratively, about 5G, because I think you can't expect to understand something that you don't understand the fundamental elements of. So there's that. We're going to talk about the scale of the threat, and we're going to talk about some good news, which I think is a big win for America, allies, and the free world. But we do need decisions. We have to make decisions. The good news is the technology, the finance, and the commercial model is now there, but we have to make decisions. So the baseline here is that you have to make these technologies accessible to people, otherwise they can't possibly make any decisions about them. As Frank said in the introduction, I'm a private equity guy, I'm a technology investor. It's my job to work with really smart technology innovators and make those ideas turn into a commercial reality that's actually functional, viable, works. So So that's kind of what I do, and in order to do my job, I have to be fluent in all those dialects of technical, language, if you will. You might call it a dialect of geek, dork, and nerd. You have to be able to speak all these different languages and translate that into something that kind of makes sense to normal people like us. And then also the other thing I want to stress here is that contrary to your typical sort of socialist narrative, as a conservative and a free market capitalist, I'm all about solutions that consider people and ecology and all those other things. The left has done a tremendous job of painting us all into this corner of just being generally bad people. That's not the case. So let's talk very quickly about what is 5G, because if you don't understand this, you've got no hope of understanding the real scale of the problem here. And conservatives, unfortunately, are pretty bad when it comes to understanding a lot of technology concepts. There's lots of people who can't even work email still. It's remarkable. And we've got to pick up a game on that, otherwise, we'll get beaten every time. The problem you have with 5G is you'll hear lots and lots of buzzwords all the time, things that you don't understand at all, and then you'll basically let the whole thing wash over you because you're kind of lost at the beginning. You'll hear about peak data rate, user experience data rate, latency. You'll hear about that all the time. Network energy efficiency, mobility, connection density, all these things, and it's just kind of flying over your head, and at this point you glaze over. In practical terms, what does 5G really mean? It's things like enhanced mobile virtual reality and augmented reality. That's not just about playing Pokemon Go. It's about the type of functionality where, as I'm standing here explaining a frequency spectrum, as you look at me, if you held up a device or you were wearing a pair of glasses, you would see a representation floating in front of my face of where all the parts of the spectrum are, and this is additional information that's augmenting your experience of reality. You can do that with 5G. It's things like being able to use combinations of different types of wireless technologies to serve underserved or unserved areas, rural areas, things like that. You can interlace all that stuff when you're talking about 5G technology. It's about ultra reliable, low latency communications. Now again, that sounds like a real mouthful. Why does that matter? Well, it's nice to have nice, clean, clear communication, but it means you can have things like factory automation or remote surgery. Latency is lag, basically. So you can perform an operation at a distance using a robot with zero lag between your inputs and the cutting surface. It's remarkable stuff, but it's only possible with 5G. Enhanced V2X, that's vehicles to anything. Vehicles to pedestrians, vehicles to infrastructure, things in the way, stuff going on, inputs constantly between vehicles, including flying ones. You won't be able to have any flying vehicles until you've got all this kind of communication going on between the vehicle itself and the surroundings and the occupants. You can do that with 5G. And then, of course, the one that everybody hears about, which is massive Internet of Things. So sensors everywhere, sensors all over the place. Networks, smartphones, buildings, smart cities, precision agriculture, sensors everywhere. You can only process that in a 5G environment. So it's a lot more than just, bigger, faster downloads of movies and games. That's the kind of narrative that's pushed at the consumer because they think that's the only thing the consumer's interested in, so that's all you tend to hear about. But 5G, to be clear, it has the power to determine economic success and failure. There is no overstatement of the case. If you doubt that, consider that there are 500,000 counterfeit retailers on Amazon right now that copy the real owner of a business or a piece of IP, clone the product, and put the price up there 1 cent lower. So the pricing algorithm in Amazon shows that product top of the list, and that's the one you buy because it was top of the list and it was cheapest. That's happening in real time on Amazon already. Now, if you use 5G to look at the inventory levels in any given region or market in the moment, you can adjust your pricing and destroy anyone else in that space. This is immensely significant. But more than that, it controls power over life and death. And I want you to remember that point because we're going to come back to that. So what are the challenges of 5G? It's basically about management of spectrum, of data and compute, and cost. That's really what it boils down to. Health is not an issue. I can explain that if anyone wants to see me afterwards, but health is not an issue with 5G, even though there's been a narrative push that it is. Very quickly on the subject of spectrum management, you have to understand the difference between wavelength and frequency. So wavelength is the length of a sine wave. Frequency is how often that effectively occurs in a given period of time. Why does this matter? Essentially, the longer wavelength you've got, the further it will travel, but the less carrying capacity it has. The higher the frequency you've got, the more carrying capacity it has, but it won't go so far, and it requires a lot more energy to push it. So this means that essentially what you want is the best of both worlds. You want to be in the middle of that spectrum. Well, the issue is that everywhere else in the world, that is where the 5G battle is occurring. But that part of the spectrum, and we're using some simplifications here for expediency, but that part of the spectrum in the US is currently controlled by the Department of Defense. So there's some debate about using a completely different part of the spectrum called millimeter wave, but millimeter wave is much higher frequency. It involves a lot more power use. It involves a lot more frequent towers and implementations, which drives up your network infrastructure cost. So, for all of those things, there are issues there. That's just the spectrum piece. So what's the threat? Well, it starts because the way licenses are currently apportioned in effectively every major market is they end up going out to a bid process where the usual suspects come along and they bid up the value of these licenses, and then they get that spectrum. And what that typically results in is you have whole rural areas completely underserved, because obviously to recover that investment in license, the investors focus all their efforts on regional, kind of urban, dense markets where they can recover the most revenue. It means that the prices tend to stay high because it's the same people bidding for the licenses all the time. It means that spectrum's underutilized because they tend to focus it all on certain markets where they'll get the best bang for the buck. And it also means the same operators end up rushing into the welcoming arms of the Chinese, who provide very low-cost network infrastructure equipment. So if you've paid through the nose for the spectrum, then all that's left in your cash kitty is very limited amount of money to pay for your network infrastructure. So the Chinese are exploiting this approach to spectrum provision by providing a product that neatly fits into everybody's available budget. Why would China go to such lengths to do that? Why would you provide such massive subsidy? Well, it's because they understand that the power of these networks and the data is enormous. It will bestow a power more complete and fungible than any weapon system ever deployed on this planet. You can contextualize this as like in the Marvel Avengers universe as basically saying it's like Thanos with all 5 Infinity Stones. Basically, it's control over everything. It will allow you to annihilate anybody's commercial position, marginalize anybody's military forces in a given theatre, negate somebody's popular support, and basically crash all of your cars, pacemakers, and supply chains. You can do that kind of thing with 5G technology. So I'm not joking when I say it is power over economic futures and even life and death. This is all real. I can walk you through the examples if you want to have them afterwards. I'm just trying to get through some of this stuff. So if you gave me a choice between domination of 5G and unlimited nuclear missiles and other weapons, I'll take 5G all day long. China is a totalitarian communist government that has somewhere between 1 and 3 million people in actual concentration camps, and you can't give those people control of this. They've made it clear they will stop at nothing and see all means as legitimate, including targeting families far in the rear of the battlefield. I mean, this is a Chinese military doctrine book that you've probably all read, Unrestricted Warfare. It makes it absolutely clear that they consider that a legitimate means of warfare. 5G is simply the best tool they could ever have hoped for, and they will not hesitate to use it. These are the same guys from the Great Leap and Tiananmen Square and the one-child policy that we've heard about. They cannot be allowed to dominate 5G. America must have its own secure 5G solution and provide alternative leadership for the free world. The good news is I'm pleased to say that we now can. So if we recap the challenge, it's management of spectrum, data and compute, and cost. You've been told they've got us beat, that we don't even have the technical capability or the skills anymore after years of offshoring, and that we will never muster the capital to roll this out. What if I told you we do in fact have the technology to do this with superior computation power and energy efficiency, with a totally secure US supply chain and completely cyber and EMP hardened? We actually have that. The spectrum's there. We also have what we believe is a very workable business model for all stakeholders. It's a private sector solution. It includes everybody, including the ignored rural folk, reduces costs, and it drives huge benefit for the US economy. What do we need? Timely decisions, not ruled by committee. We need more widespread understanding of what's at stake here, because people don't understand the things that I've just explained to you. They can't possibly understand the severity. And we need more of the same excellent, bold leadership that the White House has been showing with things like the executive orders on secure supply chain and resilience. So it's about decisions and communications. Thanks.
Sure. Question?
Quick question. I was made aware recently that the UK has been having some internal debate about whether or not to use the Chinese firm Huawei for their infrastructure, and that defense people do not want to use it, but Theresa May was overriding them. You know, she's about to be gone, but apparently one guy was even fired for coming out and spilling the beans on it. Do you know anything about that situation?
So,
and whether our intelligence people are concerned if they can work with them and share intelligence?
Are you picking on me because I've got a funny accent? No, it's a good question actually, and it's a terrible thing. Obviously, for the Chinese, picking off the Five Eyes as they're known is a tremendous coup, and Theresa May has apparently gone off on a particular tangent in that regard because the security services over there are quite vehement that they want nothing to do with it. They said the same thing about the Chinese-backed plan to build a nuclear power plant called Hinkley C. And part of the deal there, orchestrated by the former Prime Minister David Cameron, was that Chinese money would come in and provide the capital for this, somewhere in the region of sort of 35 to 50 billion pounds, and the Chinese would get complete control of another nuclear reactor site. And MI5 came out and said, this is absolute madness, this cannot happen. And it turned into a big tussle. So the same thing has happened on this 5G thing. Thankfully, that the people voted with their feet in a recent election. The Prime Minister, Theresa May, will be considering alternative career options now, and not a moment too soon. I'm just really glad I'm an American, frankly, but we can save them because we've got a great solution now. So your question's a very good one. We have an all US secure supply chain solution that will absolutely be a great opportunity for all of America's allies to kind of jump on board with and provide a real alternative to that. Because that's how they're getting in. They're getting in because they're exploiting a cost-driven strategy, and they're the only opportunity in the room. So as our colleague from South Sudan has said, you know, you can't beat something with nothing. If nobody else is there saying, hey, we've got this, then what are they to do? So I hope that answers your question.
Good. Adequately.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
I think the good news is that President Trump is over there speaking with Her Majesty's government as we speak, and I have the feeling that the costs to Britain for the special relationship, in particular the intelligence sharing piece of it, will be a very important argument against going down that road, so stay tuned. We've had a sneak preview in Liang Che's comments about the U.S. underwriting many of the horrible things we've been talking about emanating from Communist China at the moment. I'm very pleased to have my colleague, friend Roger Robinson, former Senior Director for International Economic Affairs at the Reagan National Security Council, one of the men who helped President Reagan translate the 1970s version of the Committee on the Present Danger into a strategy for taking down the USSR. And we're pleased to have him come back to talk a little bit more about a case study of how American investors are unwittingly enabling the sort of police state apparatus that Lon Chow also talked about, and talked to us about Hick Vision. Roger Robinson. He is these days, among other things, chairing the Prague Security Studies Institute, and I believe it's in that capacity that you're here.
I am. And what's our timetable? About 15 minutes. Excellent. I'll try to observe it for once. Well, it's as always, a privilege to have a chance to speak to you today. As Frank knows, and the committee has rather fulsomely explored this rather new topic of the Chinese corporate presence in the U.S. capital markets. And to the surprise of many, we're not talking about small change. We're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars of oftentimes high risk, what folks would, I think, immediately conclude are Chinese bad actors from the perspective of national security and human rights abuses that have successfully entered our markets, and in so doing, the portfolios of average Americans, including those in the room. Now, it's not just a few Americans. I don't know how many Americans total are in the markets, maybe 180, 200 million if I took a rough guess. So we're talking about the bulk of the population of the United States. And as you may also guess, not having heard much about this subject, if anything, in the past, it should tell you that there's been no security-minded or human rights-minded screening mechanism ever put up over the capital markets of the United States, despite the fact that our markets are roughly the size of the rest of the world's combined. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if China has $1 trillion in exposure in our markets. It's a very difficult subject to research. We've been at it for a couple of years, and I feel that even now we're just at the biopsy stage of trying to understand this pathology. Because make no mistake, these are not necessarily benign entities. They are ones that we would be concerned about. For example, we talked about Hike Vision. Obviously, they are one of the world's, if not the world's, leading provider of surveillance cameras that are littering the tops of the walls of the concentration camps housing 1, 2, or more million Uyghurs. This is something I'd like to come back to because we are finally getting action in that portfolio, having highlighted the fact that Americans are unwittingly aiding and abetting the concentration camp business, which is something that I think we'd all be loath to see as using our hard-earned investment dollars, whether our retirement systems or one of other many funds, from index funds to exchange-traded funds, mutual funds. It's a long list. And it's faceless fund managers that we all, myself included, turn our funds over and hope that they'll do the right thing. Well, they may be going for return, but they're not going for values, and they're not going for moral compass. That's what I'll assure you of today. Illustrations. China Unicom sounds benign enough. Listed on the New York Stock Exchange, no less. A serial PLA contractor. They provide the telecom services to the Chinese military in the South China Sea, including its signal intelligence facilities. They provide North Korea with its only internet service. That should tell you something. They are the entity that provided the wherewithal for the PLA's most aggressive cyber attack unit, APT-1, to hack into hundreds of American companies and steal our competitive information so that their state-owned enterprises of China would be able to be even more assured than they already are of taking these contracts. So that is a small profile of MSCI, and we're still, they're in the MSCI Emerging Market Index. I was meant Hike Vision now we're talking about. Besides being on the New York Stock Exchange, it's also in the MSCI Emerging Market Index. That index is tracked by $16 trillion of funds under management. So when a Chinese company is added to an index fund, automatically that $16 trillion buys that stock. Now, think of the windfall for China. And think of the fact that that company goes into every otherwise healthy cell of the American body politic. That's what you call going viral, instantly. And they're not alone in the MSCI. If you look at other entities that have found this promised land for China, this very efficient way of entering the portfolios of the American people in one shot, look at other participants. AVIC Aircraft. That sounds innocent enough. What do? Well, they produce a range of fighter aircraft and unmanned aerial vehicles. They're responsible for China's anti-ship missiles deployed in the South China Sea. They've been sanctioned several times, but you're not going to read about that in the prospectus that they're submitting to the SEC, supposedly recording material risks so that all of us are properly informed before we make an investment decision. You don't see these types of profiles appear there, despite, again, the materiality of that risk to share value and corporate reputation. I mean, even if we put moral compass and our national security concerns aside, we still have the fact that these are fundamental market violations where all of us need to disclose our risks properly, and yet the Chinese get a free pass in not doing so. More recently, AVIC has provided Iran's new ground-based anti-ship cruise missiles, which may be readied as we speak to use against American naval forces in the Sixth Fleet and beyond. Moving on, China's shipbuilding. They just build commercial ships, right? Well, think again. Guided missile destroyers, they build nuclear ballistic missile submarines. They're the ones that are targeting our cities. They're the ones that are targeting your families. And they're the ones that are benefiting from your investment dollars, as in the people in this room, much less our fellow Americans. Has this issue ever seen the light of day? Do you recall anybody talking about this on Capitol Hill, in the executive branch, in the media, in a cocktail party? You'd think that somebody would have said something by now, but they didn't, did they? Now, I'm talking about empirical facts here. I'm not talking about my opinion versus yours on something like missile defense. So this should tell you something else. It tells you that the very fact that we don't know about this and that we're focused almost single-mindedly on U.S.-China trade, as important as it is, because this is where they live and die. This is the money. This was the money with the Soviet Union. That's what we went after. We went after their hard currency cash flow. We went after their escape valves in Western governments and banks providing those credits. They'd be up today if Ronald Reagan had not put clamps on every one of the life support tubes that we were providing And guess what? Here we go again. Now, Hikvision, I'll conclude by saying, it could be a success story. This issue has been out there for a while. The human rights community, our friends at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation and others, have been alert to this for a long time, that they were aiding and abetting these concentration camps and the fate of this massive number of people that you can see from space. Well, but it's hard to give it expression. It's hard to get critical mass attention, much less action. Well, we've made a breakthrough there, which is we're now able to look at publicly traded Chinese companies with a presence in our capital markets who are providing the wherewithal for that facial recognition technology, for those very surveillance cameras that keep them tucked away behind razor wire. Now, this is out there. And Victims of Communism and others have made it so. Now we're hearing that Hikvision may be being readied for the entity list of the Department of Commerce, where you need a license to supply any components. I mean, this could be a major problem for Hikvision, to say the least. You see what's happened to Huawei. You saw what happened to ZTE before that. And I think, with any luck, Hikvision is going to hit the wall on that entity list, remembering that their parent company has already been put on the entity list because they're, big surprise, a national security violator. Can we have more Hikvisions? Can we bring recognition to this issue once and for all? And the answer is yes, we can. We have the power to do this. This is our money. We have a right to hold Wall Street accountable. We have a duty to do so. And finally, we can give expressions to our most coveted values, both national security and human rights. Thank you very much.
Roger, I just want to take the liberty to ask you to specifically address one question that you've talked about more elsewhere than I think you did here. And that is the disparity between the way these companies from China are being treated by our Securities and Exchange Commission relative to how they treat our own companies. Would you just talk about that as another place where we need to make changes?
Sure, this gets down to disclosure and accountability. And that's why those remedies can serve us so well in this case. Namely, in the U.S., or a West European company, or any of those of our allies, face a rigorous test when they come to the New York Stock Exchange, NASDAQ, even to a lesser extent, our over-the-counter market. That the disclosure is fundamental, as is risk management. You're supposed to record any material risk to share value and corporate reputation, and if you don't, it's called by the SEC a material omission, which is legally actionable. So it's against the law. I mean, let's be clear, this is not a small thing. And yet, whereas we will go after an American company for a material omission, but China doesn't write any of this down. They don't tell you that they're in the South China Sea. They don't tell you that they're underwriting North Korean nuclear and missile capabilities. They don't tell you that they've been sanctioned before. They don't tell you that their employees have been arrested for espionage. Where's that in the risk section? And isn't that material to my decision as to whether or not to buy the stock? They can be sanctioned. I mean, even if you put our values aside, what about share value? What's going to happen to their corporate reputation when they show up on the front page of the Wall Street Journal or something of that kind? So this is actually, ironically, evening the playing field. This is preferential treatment. Now, Imagine the irony. I mean, how sickening an affair this really is.
One more question from the audience. Anybody?
Yes.
Let's get
Sorry. Oh, are you up to
right here, Peter.
Roger, what's preventing the SEC from doing its job?
Well, in part, the SEC has never been confronted with the notion that should be obvious to all of us and every American, which is the materiality of national security abuses in your background or in your network of subsidiaries, not to mention human rights abuses like are taking place in Tibet and vis-a-vis the Uyghurs. So these are not acknowledged to be material risk categories. How convenient. You know, how lovely for Beijing that we just kind of give that one a miss, don't we? We're interested in corruption and we're interested in a number of other things, but these two categories don't seem to make the cut. And that's what we're able to change, and that's where we should be headed.
Finally, I'm very pleased to say we have with us one of the men who helped inspire the Committee on the Present Danger of China, who has been very active with the committee and particularly has participated brilliantly in a number of the previous threat briefings that we've done here. In fact, I was very anxious to have him come back and reprise a message that he imparted to some of the people Roger was just talking about on Wall Street in one of the programs that we did up there about a month or so ago about freedom and what's really on the line at the moment now with communist China and its efforts to deprive really the freedom of the world. His name, of course, is Steve Bannon. He has just blown in from Europe, where he was working to prop up freedom over there. We're very grateful to him for that. And he is, of course, a former strategic advisor to President Trump and chairman of a great news organization, Breitbart, and member of the Committee on the Present Danger of China. Welcome, Steve.
Thank you. That's a reason I wanted to get back here today was to give you a report from the front. You know, I think the last time I saw you folks was the last week of April, and historic. Frank, I think you underplayed it with Roger Robinson and Kyle Bass and the team. A historic Committee on the Present Danger briefing at the St. Regis Hotel in Midtown Manhattan about finance, Wall Street, capital, and how it's created this Frankenstein monster, which is the radical cadre, the CCP, that controls China. I've had the opportunity since we last talked to go to Norway, Berlin, Italy, France, London, and Kazakhstan. And here's what's fascinating. People have actually started to see the videos that we've been doing. People are actually starting to understand what's going on. In every capital I was in, and I was over there principally for the European parliamentary elections, but in every capital where I would meet with business leaders, political activists, people in the populist movement, people in the sovereignty movement, some people who are in government today, and particularly financial people, we are at an inflection point because the world is starting to awaken that something has gone terribly, terribly wrong. And the reason it went terribly wrong is because of us. It is our capital, our technology, our elites that have imposed this on the Chinese people. This is not about the United States versus China. This is not about the industrial democracies versus China. The Chinese people are among the most noble, hardworking, family-oriented, terrific people on the face of the planet. And their history of when they're allowed to have freedom of speech and freedom of religion and freedom of assembly and property rights and the rule of law is unparalleled, second to none. In Hong Kong and in Taiwan, in Southeast Asia and Singapore, in London, and in the United States of America. It was driven home to me actually in Berlin. I was talking about, I was making an analysis and doing an analysis and a presentation about Made in China 2025. As you all know, the three prongs of the geopolitical tsunami that is hitting us from Beijing, from President Xi and Wan Xishan, is One Belt, One Road, Made in China 2025, and Huawei's 5G rollout. Game, set, match. The most extraordinary, ambitious, audacious geopolitical roll-up in mankind's history. Even if you give the benefit of the doubt, which I do not, but let's for a second do it, to the elites, to the Henry Kissinger and Graham Allison and that crowd, the Thucydides trap, which, by the way, is inculcated in all the elites when you go around and talk to them, whether it's in Paris or in Berlin or in London. In the 16 examples, I say, it's interesting. You talk about, rising powers, declining powers, Peloponnesian War, Athens, Sparta. There's not one example where the so-called rising power was financed by the elites of the declining power. What happened to us? Look at the people of China. Across a broad section. Uyghurs, Falun Gong, Dalai Lama, the Tibetan Buddhists, the underground evangelical Christian church, the underground Catholic church, and the basic citizens of China, day in and day out, in a totalitarian surveillance state. Completely with no property rights, no freedom of speech, no religious rights, a totalitarian state that the elites of the West financed and basically gave the technology and the equipment to. NPR had a great report a couple of weeks ago. I think it was 500 companies. There was 500 companies that they had gone to the files, had all somehow gone to I think it was the Treasury Department, Department of Commerce, and complained about not just forced technology transfer, but cyber intrusions, technology theft, forced technology transfers, all there. The reporter, no right-winger, not from Breitbart, from National Public Radio, went around. Every executive said, it's terrible. We're getting crushed. Not one executive would go on camera, would be interviewed, would give their name, etc., for fear. In Germany, it hit me in the solar plexus. Somebody sat there and said, Merkel and this crowd, and the Davos crowd, and the guys in Brussels are exactly like Hillary Clinton and the elites in the United States. They lost confidence in themselves. They lost faith in themselves. They actually believed that we are the declining power and that they're the rising power. And who's going to pay for that? Who's first paying for it is the Chinese people. It's upon their shoulders that this burden has been foisted. The great part about this committee and what we've been doing, the work, is it's off the shoulders of who's the closest equivalent to old 100 names. And that's the deplorables. If it wasn't in the summer and in the fall of 2016, we wouldn't be here. this would not have happened. Because the deplorables found an instrument. Donald Trump. And that instrument, as you can see in England today, is an armor, in all of its imperfections, is an armor-piercing shell. But it's the deplorables that said, I don't understand all this high finance, and I don't understand all this, mumbo jumbo, but here's what I do understand. The factories left, the jobs left with them, and the opioids came. If you go to Germany, they understand that Made in China 2025 is absolutely targeted to, was it the Mittelstand? The private companies are the backbone of German society that employed the deplorables of Germany. It's aimed right at them. The robotics and the precision engineering, it's coming right at them. They no longer can hide, and their elites have allowed this to happen. The great point of this inflection point, it's totally anti-elite how we got here. This is true populism. This is true, the grit and determination. The only way that we're going to take down this radical cadre, the CCP, is old 100 names. When finally they've had enough of it, and finally they understand that we in the West are going to hold our elites accountable. We're not going to do this anymore. You've seen the work of Roger Robinson. You've seen the work of different members on the committee. And now people are all shocked. They can't believe there's been gambling going on in this establishment, right? Here's your winnings. But from Kazakhstan to Berlin to Paris to Italy to London to Bergen, Norway, when I show up, they want to talk about populism. They want to talk about this sovereignty movement. They want to talk about nationalism. But you know what they really want to talk about first? They want to talk about China. It permeates everything. It is the central issue of our time. And the central issue, the core issue, is how we took the great values of the West and looked the other way for money. My favorite publication, the New York Times, today on its page 1, right hand, has the brutal expose of a member of the cabinet, Elaine Chao, a Harvard graduate, I might add, Harvard Business School, based upon the work, part of the work of Peter Schweitzer, I'm very proud to say, and the Government Accountability Institute. This work came from many years ago. Remember, we did Clinton Cash. Took years to do that, to expose the Clintons. Bernie Sanders and other Democrats wanted to touch it. Bernie had a pillow fight during that the primary. Wouldn't touch it. Mention it every now and again, wouldn't touch it. The Trump campaign, we went right at it, of her corruption. When Peter and the team finished, this is back in 2014, he said they thought, what should we do next? How about Chinese influence peddling in this city? And it was Peter's team that came up with the two examples. We're going to do we're going to do Republicans and Democrats. This is where they say there's no bipartisanship. When it comes to taking Chinese money, they're bipartisan. But Elaine Chao and McConnell, if you read the book, and there's a lot of questions to be answered, and I'm sure they're going to be answered. But what's most shocking is Joe Biden. Now, Joe Biden is running for president of the United States, and last time I looked, he's 32 points ahead in the Democratic primary, right? 23 points here, 32 points here. I think if you look at some of these individual states now, they're putting out the polls, he's matching up or actually beating President Trump in some of the core states that we have to win. I'm waiting for the New York Times. I noticed they started with the Republican on the bipartisan part, right? I'm just waiting for the paper of record, because these are actually, I know some of these are these are great reporters, to do the Democrat. But Joe Biden is going to have to answer some basic questions before he is even eligible to think about being president of the United States. He's got to answer not just to the people in the United States, he's got to answer to the Chinese people why he took 1.5, or his family took $1.5 billion in a private equity fund to invest, and then why they invested that money in these surveillance companies. We have to know how he's been compromised. We have to know how much money they took. We have to know, we got to see the documents that they pitched. We have to go back to the beginning. His son is totally and completely incompetent to run a private equity firm. You guys know how hard it is to raise that kind of money, the track record you have to have, the years of experience. And what was Biden over there in 2013? What he was over there for? The Munich of the 21st century is those islands in the South China Sea. They're going to cause more problems for Asian people in Korea, in Taiwan, in Singapore, in Japan. Those are stationary aircraft carriers. They allow the radical cadre of the CCP to say, this is a territorial sea, this is ours. Biden went over there, and Biden looked the other way. And Biden looked the other way in that entire time frame when they took hard cash from the Chinese Communist Party, the Bank of China. Remember, the Bank of China, unlike other G20 countries, is not independent. It reports, not to the state, it reports to the Chinese Communist Party. I know we got a time limit, I got a bolt, but here's what I want to tell you. The work that we're doing here is incredibly, incredibly important, and people that matter are looking at this now. Major publications, every day there's another expose. Every day they're asking questions like Roger Robinson just asked. Why are there different reporting requirements? Why can't you see the accounting papers? Look at these bankruptcies. Look at this bank that failed the other day, the regional bank in China. The other one's on the watch list. What is it, 25? I think it's 20 have not reported latent reporting. Wait till those dominoes start falling. Let's talk about the World Bank. Let's go into the World Bank and find out what they're doing to finance China. This is an outrage. And here's why it's an outrage. It's an outrage that we in this city, in Wall Street, in the city of London, in Frankfurt, can fully understand what's happening to the Chinese people. They all know what's happening to the Uyghurs. They all know what's happening to the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan Buddhists. They all know what's happening to Falun Gong. They all know what's happening to the underground Christian and Catholic Church. They understand the surveillance, totalitarian dictatorship of what it's doing to the Chinese people. Everybody knows. You can't hide anymore. And yet, they still want to finance it. They still want to provide the technology for it because they want to make a buck. We have to stop that. We have to hold ourselves accountable. This was not Xi. This was not Wang Xishan. This was us. We did this. That Frankenstein monster is our responsibility. We have a fiduciary. And I like the way that Roger Robinson used underwriting. We have a fiduciary responsibility to unwind this. This is not about trade. This is not about soybeans. This is not about steel. This is the highest moral imperative we have. I don't want to hear people say, oh, in the 1930s this, 1930s that. That was horrible. That's then. This is now. We see this. We're going to have to live with this. 100 years from now, they're going to accuse us. And that's why I'm so proud to work with you guys. Our work's just started, but I'm telling you it's getting traction. And here's what. The rats are leaving the ship, and they know they can't hide anymore. Thank you very much.
As I call Brian Kennedy up, I just wanted to say a salute to Steve Bannon on his way out the door. The quick, succinct takeaway from all of this, I think, is something he said in New York. We live in a sort of homage to Abraham Lincoln. a global house divided, half free and half slave. And the people who are enslaving the part that is unfree are the Chinese Communist Party. And the people who are enabling them to do that are us. I'm going to close out my part of this by just saying thank you to you all for being here, for staying, as well as for joining us via the live stream and video. Let me reintroduce my colleague and friend, Brian Kennedy, Chairman of the committee.
Thank you. Thank you, Frank. And let me just add my thanks for everyone who is here with us today and everybody who's online. I thought Steve Bannon was great, and I really just wanted to answer his question. He asked, how is it possible that we've gotten to the point where we're financing China and their efforts to destroy the United States? And I think I'd answer by saying that we no longer believe in the virtues of our civilization. We no longer believe in what is good about America. That American elites have spent 100 years telling us that we were a bad people, that our history is deficient, that our principles are inadequate. And I believe one reason Donald Trump was elected was because Americans don't buy that. They believe we have a good country. We believe in the principles of human equality. It has been the efforts of this country that has provided more freedom and justice for more people than at any other time in human history. The work of this committee is to remind Americans of that fact. If we get that right, nothing China can do will be able to stop us. And if we get that wrong, God help us. Thank you again for coming. It's a great pleasure to be with all of you, and the meeting of this committee is today adjourned.